We're glad that you're here this morning. Last week was just really unusual. We have, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know of ever a time we've ended up having to cancel services for the weekend. In conversations with local police and Boulder County sheriffs and CDOT and a number of other agencies who were asking us actually to assist by keeping people off the road, we ended up going ahead and closing. And now some of you got the message, and whenever that's going to happen, I can't, our goal is to not do that, but whenever you're uncertain, if you'll go to our website or check our voicemail, a lot of social media places where we're posting stuff, our app, all that kind of thing, it'll give you information there. So if you're curious, there were a few of you who did drive over here, though. We had some staff here to try to connect with people. We tried to make it easier for you so that you wouldn't walk in. So one of our staff members got to work busy and put this sign up. So when I drove in last Sunday morning, I came over Sunday morning and this sign was up. I was really blessed by that. And I realize some of you think, and I'm not going to rat the individual out, I know some of you think they simply can't spell, but that's not true. This is the Greek word for what are you doing out? It's slippery outside. But anyway. So as a result of that, we had planned on last weekend ending our series that we've been doing, I'm a Bridge, as we've been talking about how do we love our neighbors and ways to get engaged and what God has called us to. And this weekend, we were launching a series called Soul Keeping. And I'm really excited about this series, Soul Keeping. It's talking about how do we take care of our souls. For those of you who are followers, what are some things you can be doing to restore your soul, to care for your soul? For those of us, for those who aren't followers, it's an opportunity. What does God want me to do? How can He help fix my soul? What's the connection point there? And so we want to talk about the issues that rip at the inside of us, that whole being of us, our souls. And so over the next several weeks as we head into Easter, we're going to be looking at it. There's a lot of opportunities. There's some books we want to encourage you to pick up, some small group stuff, connection points, plenty of classes, seminars. There are things this whole series that I hope you'll get engaged in. And it really was a follow-on from I'm a Bridge. How is it that we're connecting with others? Because God's invited us into His story. So here's what we're going to do this morning. I'm going to give a wrap-up from last week's message that I'd planned on doing. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of it in a few minutes. It was going to be about 7, and Tim's been whispering now 3, so we'll see what we can do to speed that along. And then Ramin's going to give abbreviated version of this week's message about soul keeping. So we're going to kind of tie the two together, and I actually do think in so many ways these two are connected. Now remember, we've been looking at what the Apostle Paul said in a short passage of Scripture in 1 Corinthians 9, and his whole intent was that he was talking about what he was doing in a focused way, what he was doing in an intentional way to help connect other people to the grace of God, helping others, his friends, family members, communities where he'd go into, all the mission work he'd done to start churches. All of that centered around, as he said, so that by every means possible, he might help people find God's grace in their life. Now, you remember what I said a couple weeks ago, that when you read the Bible, first you read for who wrote this, who are they writing to, what would the people who have received that, how would they have understood it, what was the context for it, and then what is that saying to us? And so we've been looking at 1 Corinthians 9, the Apostle Paul, who had come to know God's grace in his life in such a dramatic way, and now he was desperate to help other people find that same grace he'd found. And he was writing to Christians. And so this whole series we've been doing was for those of us who are followers of Christ. If you're not a follower of Christ, Paul wasn't challenging you to this. He was saying if you're following Christ, then God is inviting you into His story. He's inviting you to be engaged and to care about the stuff He cares about. So how are you engaged in helping people discover that grace? And then how do we hear that? I think it's that challenge that comes from Paul about what am I doing? What am I choosing? Not what am I doing as part of a church family, not what am I doing at maybe my small group or some ministry team I'm on, but what am I doing to be engaged in the very things that God is inviting us to be engaged in, which is helping people find Him. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul ends this bit of section he's been challenging on about his own desire with some great words. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I'm going to start in verse 24. Here's what he says. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training, and they do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I don't run like a man running aimlessly. I don't fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave so that after I preach to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. 3 things he says here. Talks about intentionality, talks about discipline, he talks about focus. And again, he's speaking to believers. He's speaking to Christians, people who have already discovered this grace in their lives. Now, I love how he starts this section here. And he does it, he asks a question. And he's not asking a question so that there might be some debate around the answer. He's not asking the question as if, hey, this is just a great group discussion here. Let's all, do you feel like a cow or do you feel like an elephant? What animal are you? And he's not doing that. Actually, he's asking this kind of rhetorical question, and he's doing it in a bit of a sarcastic way, which I always love because I'm from New York. The only spiritual gift I have is sarcasm. I love how he does. He's saying, hey, don't you know? Runners. They run in a race, and they run with one thing in mind, that they are going to win the race. Only one gets the prize. Only one wins. But everybody, you know that, don't you? He's saying, open your eyes, pay attention. And then he says this, and if runners who are running for a temporary crown, one that's going to fade. And remember his audience. They were the precursor to Olympic Games. In fact, the games before that were called the Isthmian Games. They actually originated around this area in Corinth. And they know that athletes were chosen from all over the region, and the very best of the athletes would come for the Isthmian Games. And when they would compete in their event, whoever won would have a laurel crown placed on his head, one made of fig leaves, and he would parade through the streets, and they would throw flower petals and honor him. And here's what Paul's saying. You know that runner, he has this moment of glory. He's got the praise and adulation of others. He gets a crown, but that crown is going to eventually dry and wither and fade. And he's saying, don't you get this? God has engaged you in this eternal race. There is this bigger story going on. And if you're running and you're going to get a prize that doesn't fade, how is it you're running? Are you intentional? Are you going after what God is after? Do you have that sense of intentionality around our friends, around our coworkers? We're heading into Easter. There's a great opportunity for us to be inviting our friends to do a simple thing. Maybe just join us in a service or maybe connect with somebody. I had dinner with a gentleman this past Friday evening, and he said, I discovered faith because a friend of mine sat down and said, I don't really know how to help you with this. Why don't we just read the Bible together? And so once a week they got together for breakfast and they read from the Gospel of John, and they would read a few verses, and then they would just talk about what they thought that meant. I don't know how you're going to be intentional, but God is saying to you, if you're in this race, you ought to be running intentionally. Now remember, Paul's not saying here that you're running to get the prize. It's all on you. It's all on your effort. It's all what you choose to do. And if you do the race right, if you run right and you cross across the finish line, God is going to welcome you into heaven. That's the prize. That can't be what he's saying here. Because remember, who's he writing to? He's writing to people who already know this grace, who already are going to get the assurance of salvation in life, who are already promised eternal life with God. What he's saying is, now that you're in that race, be intentional about how you're choosing to run in that race so that others help cross that line with you. Also, not everybody who runs in a race wins, do they? At the end of the day, somebody wins. Might be by 100th of a second, might be a whole second, but somebody, only one wins. But here's again what Paul's saying. It's not on you whether others are going to get there. It's on you to help them run in such a way so that you are intentional about helping others. The second thing he talks about is discipline. This idea that there are some things these athletes train for. Now, again, in Corinth, they would have seen it happen. Kind of like we're a region for high-end runners and bikers. In fact, we've got a group attending LifeBridge right now who are all training for Olympic marathon qualifying stuff. And this is their altitude. Ramin is one of those runners. He actually was hoping to run in the Olympics someday. I'm not one of those runners. That wouldn't describe me at all. But when you see them, there's a difference in what they're choosing and how they're living. There is some disciplined effort on their part. I love, again, how Paul says this in this passage, where he says, everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. There's some things they are choosing. There are things they are saying no to. But more importantly, there are things they're saying yes to. It isn't the choice between good and bad for them anymore. It isn't even the choice between good and better. It is the choice between what is the best I can be doing to help myself so that when I get in that race, I am running with every best part of me. What is it that you and I are doing? We're asking you to say yes to loving God and saying yes to loving your neighbors. What are you doing? How are you doing that? How's that showing up for you? What are choices you're making? What are choices that you're disciplined about? What are things you're doing that are helping you be as ready as you possibly can be to love God and love your neighbor? And then he says, and where's your focus? I don't run like someone running aimlessly. I don't fight like a boxer beating the air. I love this. Where he's saying, you've got some end in mind. You've got some place you're going with this. You're not just kind of wandering around aimlessly. You're not just kind of doing what you want. One of my kids got me this Fitbit for Christmas. You know, the whole exercise thing is supposedly monitors, you know, how you sleep and how many steps you do. And it's cool. And I'm pretty competitive. So every day I'm trying to do more steps than I did. On Friday, I did 25,000 steps. I was lost, actually. Not just running aimlessly. There's some intentional focus around this. There's some effort going on. There's a path you're headed down. You're not just a boxer beating the air. You're not shadow boxing. You know what I've discovered about a lot of us, myself at times? We're really good about talking about some of the big issues. You know, there's really bad stuff happening in the world. We ought to be more important. There's some stuff going on our side we don't like. We ought to be more. And if you could read my inbox of email, and I appreciate getting these emails. The suggestions that so many of you have for what LifeBridge could be doing and should be doing and ought to be doing, and we ought to do this program, and we did that program, and I heard about a church somewhere in Mozambique that's doing this, and I wish our church were doing that. And, you know, those are some good things and not bad ideas, and actually some of those we actually find helpful to us. But here's the deal. I find a lot of people want to talk about what we ought to be doing. A lot of us want to have conversations with other Christians about what we ought to be doing, and not a lot of us are as engaged in the game as we ought to be. We're not actually showing up. We talk about the big deal stuff. And here's what Paul is saying. That's shadow boxing. That's pretending like you're doing something, but you're just beating the air. How is it you're choosing to get in the game? Now, that doesn't mean every time we get in the game it's going to go like we want. That doesn't mean that everything we hope to do is going to follow through in the way that we plan. I love what the great American philosopher Mike Tyson said. He said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. But some of us never get punched in the face because we never get in the ring. And Paul's saying, more than anything else, I don't want to just talk about this. I don't want to just have it be something that I say is an agenda. I want to be engaged in a way so that I don't end up just being one who sits on the sideline watching others run. What gets our attention? What gets our focus? We don't know for sure if it was Paul who wrote these words or not, more than likely in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 12. Here's what he says. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance, every burden, every care, everything that weighs us down. And the sin, those choices we make that take us away from God, that entangles us. And let us run with endurance the race marked before us, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross and despised the shame, and he is now seated at the right hand of the throne. Keep your eyes on him, the writer says. And consider him who endured such hostility, so that you don't lose heart.
Well, as Rick talked about, we're taking a step forward today into a new teaching series called Soul Keeping. And soul keeping is really built on the belief that God wants to help us learn how to care for the most important part of ourselves, which is our soul. I love how Proverbs talks about it. It says, above all else, guard your heart, for it's the wellspring of life. And that word in Hebrew, heart, could just as easily be translated soul. And so what the writer is telling us of Proverbs is that in the first place in our mind, and our first priority of vital importance for all of us, is guarding, caring for, and nurturing our soul. Because from our soul, that common ground where we meet with God, from our soul, all of our life flows. Our soul is that source of life for us. And so above all else, we want to be a people who guard our hearts because it's the wellspring of our life. Now this week, as I'm carrying around this idea of soul keeping, I found myself in kind of an interesting predicament. I spent a disproportionate amount of time at the Department of Motor Vehicles. A little bit of a wild paradox there as I'm carrying these thoughts about soul keeping all week and finding myself spending significant time at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Now that happened because I was at my local neighborhood bank and I found out from my friendly teller that my driver's license was going to expire because yesterday was my birthday. So I had to get a new driver's license, right? That happens. So being a responsible person, I got on the website and I found out the 42 documents that you needed. That you needed to bring a piece of your mother's wedding dress and the hat that they gave you when you came out of the hospital, and you had to have a DNA and retina scans and, all the things you need for a driver's license. So I came ready. The other thing I did is I came early. So I showed up at early, like probably 5 minutes early before the place opened, and there's a line of 80 people already lined up by the time I got there. And so I slot into line. I'm thinking soul keeping. And I go through the line, and I finally get number B209. And B209, it's just your identity then. You're wearing it. And you find a seat next to people you didn't plan on sitting next to for a large portion of your day. And after over an hour, B209 finally comes like a clairvoyant call of salvation, over the loudspeakers. And I go up and I start the process, and then they say, well, go sit down. We're going to call you forward in a minute to get your picture taken. We'll have you on your way. I come forward to get my picture taken, final review of my pertinent information, and I find that they've got the wrong address for me. The DMV looks at me and says, hey, you need to take your place in line. I'm like, define line, please. Like, do you mean that long line that's now wrapped around the whole wall, or do you mean where I was before? And so I go sit back down, and they skip me. At the DMV. They skip me at the DMV. Eventually I go up, I get it sorted, and by the mercy and grace of the Lord, I got a driver's license that's current. So that's a beautiful thing, right? Yes. But as I thought about that story, I thought about the reality that, man, maybe I was missing something in all that. Because I just saw it as this wild paradox, like us saying, hey, after church, we're going to have a Hawaiian luau on the shores of Lake McIntosh. Why don't you please join us? I mean, I saw it as this crazy paradox. But as I started to come away from it more and think about it, what I realized is maybe God was trying to say something to me. And maybe the DMV was the best place for me to be thinking through a message on soul keeping. And the reason for that is, if I'm really honest, a lot of my life looks more like having to take an unexpected trip to the Department of Motor Vehicles than it does some kind of idyllic Hollywood script that I would write for myself. And maybe if we're all honest, our life that we've kind of planned for ourselves, we thought it was this nice, gentle arc that just kind of ascended, but our real, actual everyday life looks more like the old video game Pitfall, with a lot of ups and downs and unexpecteds and unplanned fors, and a journey that we can't always see the end of. And so what's so important about soul keeping is that soul keeping is for that kind of person. It's for the kind of person like me and maybe like you who's saying, I want to live by faith. I want to learn what it means to love God. I want to learn to love one another. I want to learn to love my neighbor, but I'm doing it in the chaos and the noise and the ups and the downs of a real life. And so what can help me find it? And what I believe so strongly, that it is in the grit and the seams of our everyday life that God forms our souls. And sometimes it's the instability that we experience in our own life that accentuates the reliability of God's grace to sustain our souls. And so as we start this series, something we want to talk about is just simply the idea of what is our soul? What is our soul? What's fascinating is we start with Jesus because he talked about it and he made it sound like it was an essential or important part of us. He said, what good is it, in Mark chapter 8, for a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? He's saying, what good is it if you do everything possible to externally gain and improve yourself, but you lose yourself in the process? And it's a rhetorical question. It's not good. And he asks the second question, or what can a man give in exchange for a soul? What's a soul worth? Once again, you can't give anything in exchange for a soul. What good would it do you to gain everything that the world has to offer and forfeit your soul in the process? And so for Jesus, the soul was of primary importance. It was so valuable, this soul that God has given us. You start scanning through scriptures, what we find quickly is that there's 800 times in the original language scriptures that we see this word soul written. In the Hebrew Old Testament, it's the word nephesh. In the Greek New Testament, it's the word suke. But when we translate the Bible into modern English, they only translate about 100 words into the word soul. And I think it's curious and I think it's telling because we're uncomfortable around things that are mysterious to us often. And it's difficult to talk about something that you can't quantify, categorize, or measure. You can't get out the scale and weigh your soul this morning. But the reality is, we can tell very quickly when our soul is heavy. And we know when our soul is feeling its worth. We know when our soul is experiencing joy. And it's this reality that our soul is the spiritual part of us. It's not physical. Spiritual. I love the way that C.S. Lewis describes the soul. He says it this way. He says, you don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. And as I kind of processed that thought this week, I thought about it this way. It's as though he's saying, we are not primarily human beings who have spiritual experiences. But we are primarily spiritual beings who are having a temporary human experience. And that kind of turns it for us. And John Ortberg, in his book that we're encouraging everyone to read, gives us this picture, and it just shows us that the soul is the integrated self. The soul is the whole person. The soul is the operating system, if you will. And a body without a soul, it's like a light bulb without electricity. It's like a computer without an operating system. It's like a spacesuit without an astronaut inside of it. A body without a soul isn't alive. And that at the core, that's what the soul is. It's that common ground where we meet God on this earth, and it's that place from which we live. It's the wellspring of our life. And so today, as we launch this series, we're just going to encourage us all to take one step forward in learning to keep our souls well. And that step is simply this: learning to open our souls to God. And asking that question of yourself today: is my soul open to God? I love how Jesus helps us with that question in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. He tells a story, and the story is about some soil. It's about some seeds. It's about a sower, and you might know this story. But what Jesus says is this: listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed, and as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on the rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop multiplying 30, 60, or even 100 times. As we read that story, there's a couple things that are constant, and the things that are constant are the sower and the seed. The scriptures tell us that the sower is generous, or you might even think reckless in how he gives the seed to all sorts of places, all sorts of soils. And the other thing that's constant is the seed itself, which Jesus will later define as the Word of God. And for Jesus, he wasn't talking about a leather-bound scripture. He was talking about himself. Because in John, it says of Jesus that he was the Word and he was with God. And that Word becomes flesh and he dwells among us and he reveals to us the fullness of God's grace and the fullness of God's truth. And so it's as though Jesus coming is a message from God to every one of our souls saying, I love you. Irrespective of how you got here, regardless of whether you think you deserve it or not, I am making an irreversible move from heaven to earth, to across to the grave, and back to the right hand of the Father to say to every soul in the room this morning, I love you. It's constant. It's reliable. The place where we see variance is in the soils. And you could go ahead and substitute soil for soul because that's what Jesus is really talking about here. And he says there's these different kinds of souls. And some souls are hardened souls because they've been trampled over. They're like a path that's been walked over, and they harden themselves in self-protection. And he says some souls are like souls of gravel where there's a looking like something's growing up. It's superficial. It's coming up from the ground, but underneath, it's shallow. And then he talks about the kind of soul that actually is good soil. It starts to grow up. It's actually producing a little bit here. It had some great moments, but it got distracted by other things. And it got cluttered. And so it didn't accomplish what the sower intended it to. And I've always read those stories, and primarily I've read it as though, wow, look at all these soils that are so far from what God intended them to be. But I wonder if we would just spin it for 1 second and imagine together how close every one of those souls was to God. And to think about the reality that if you're here this morning and maybe you identify with that and say, yeah, I got hurt along the way. I felt like I got trampled on or pressed down, and because of that, my soul has been hardened for quite a while. During this time, we just want to say, let's open our souls to God. If you're someone who's been keeping up with the exterior things and you know what to do and the right behaviors and the right words to say and not say, but if you're honest, underneath, you know that there's not real depth there. This is the time to say, God, I want to open my soul to you. If you're someone who's maybe had some great moments in your faith life, in your journey, and you've grown up, but you found recently that, man, I've just been distracted and my soul is cluttered. It's a time to say, God, I'm going to open my soul more to you than to all of the noise that's competing for my affection and my attention. And for all of us, when we open our soul, what we discover is that our soul already has a keeper. Psalm 23 talks about him. It says that the Lord is my shepherd, and he makes me not lack anything. We don't lack anything when we have the Lord as our shepherd. And he guides us beside quiet waters, and he restores our soul. Our soul has a keeper, and he's a faithful keeper. He's a good keeper. He's a loving keeper, and he's a keeper who promises to walk with you as you open your soul to him.